The moment Prince Harry opened the envelope, he could feel the weight of decades pressing down on him. A weight that wasn't just about titles, protocol, or public expectation. No, this was personal. The kind of revelation that could unravel everything he had ever believed about himself, his family, and his place in the world. Imagine living your entire life believing one man is your father, a figure who shaped your earliest memories, your identity, your understanding of who you are, only to discover that someone else might actually hold that role. And not just anyone, but a man whose shadow had lingered around the royal household in whispers for years. James Hewitt, the cavalry officer, the man who had long been the subject of speculation in tabloid columns, royal biographies, and quiet conversations in the corridors of power. Now, it wasn't just gossip. Now, it was a test result, and it didn't lie. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. For the first time in his life, Harry wasn't thinking about charity events, public appearances, or the expectations of a global audience. He was thinking about himself, about the little boy who had looked up to a man he called Dad, and the swirling, confusing emotions that came with discovering that his biological reality might be completely different. How do you reconcile love with betrayal, loyalty with deception, and, perhaps most terrifying of all, what do you do when the world is watching every moment of your emotional unraveling? The rumors surrounding James Hewitt had been persistent for decades. Whispers that Princess Diana, Harry's mother, had engaged in a secret relationship. Whispers that Charles, distant and often preoccupied, may not be Harry's biological father after all. The tabloids had feasted on speculation, leaving crumbs of scandal and innuendo in their wake. And Harry, like many of us might, had pushed the rumors aside, a survival tactic in a life under constant scrutiny. But now, armed with DNA evidence that promised clarity, the speculation was about to collide head-on with reality. Imagine the tension in that room at Kensington Palace. The quiet hum of the security detail outside, the sterile chill of the royal interior, and the envelope resting on the mahogany table, holding decades of truth and lies in equal measure. Harry's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper, not because he feared what it might say, but because he already knew his life was about to change forever. How do you prepare for a truth that undermines everything you thought you knew about your family, your identity, and the narrative you've lived under your entire life? The public thinks of Prince Harry as the cheerful, outspoken royal, the one who challenges tradition while still embodying a certain regal poise. They don't see the internal conflict, the quiet heartbreak that comes from living in the shadow of an impossible standard. They don't see the late-night reflections, the private tears, the moments when Harry wonders if everything he knows about love and loyalty is just an illusion. And for decades, he lived in that tension, not knowing that the answers he sought were just a test away. This story is not just about scandal. It's not just about royal gossip or tabloid fodder. It is about identity, about family, and about the human need to know where we come from and who we truly are. It is about betrayal. The kind that cuts not in public view, but in the quiet recesses of your heart, leaving you questioning every interaction, every memory, every smile. And it's about revelation, the kind that forces you to reconsider your past and plan for a future that may no longer make sense. But let's rewind for a moment. Before the envelope, before the DNA test, before the world would find out, before the shock waves began to ripple through Buckingham Palace, Kensington, and the global media, there was a life being lived, a childhood being shaped, and a series of choices being made that, unbeknownst to Harry, were laying the groundwork for this explosive revelation. Harry's earliest memories were colored by both love and tension. He adored his mother, a woman whose warmth and kindness were often at odds with the public persona she was forced to maintain. But he also experienced the cold, calculated distance of his father, a man consumed by duty and tradition, leaving little room for the kind of paternal affection most children take for granted. In private, whispers circulated about Diana's unhappiness, about infidelity, and about a man who had entered and exited the royal household like a shadow, James Hewitt. Yet, these were whispers, hints that never fully formed into certainty until now. Consider the emotional complexity of Harry's position. On one hand, he has loyalty to the man who raised him, who taught him the protocols, who provided him with protection and a path into adulthood. On the other, there is the undeniable pull of biological truth, the desire to understand who he truly is, genetically and fundamentally. And the collision of these two forces? Devastating, heartbreaking, shattering, and deeply human. As we move through this story, keep in mind the stakes. The monarchy, a global audience watching every tear, every word, every subtle facial expression. The media's relentless appetite for scandal. And the deeply personal journey of a man forced to reconcile love and loyalty with betrayal and revelation. But what's perhaps even more compelling than the shock of the DNA results is the question that follows. How will Harry navigate this new reality? Will he confront Charles? Will he confront the world? Or will he retreat, carrying the knowledge in private, bearing the weight of history and heritage that now feels uncertain? These are questions that nobody could answer in the first moments after the revelation. And the uncertainty itself became part of the story, a story that would unfold with twists, emotional spikes, and confrontations nobody saw coming. And the timing couldn't have been more explosive. At a moment when the world was focused on royal stability, charity initiatives, and public perception, this revelation threatened to rewrite everything. Every handshake, every public smile, every carefully curated photo of family unity was suddenly imbued with new meaning. Was Harry's smile genuine? Was his respect for Charles unconditional? Could he even reconcile with a father who, genetically, might not be his own? The anticipation builds further when you consider James Hewitt himself. The man at the center of decades of speculation. Calm, collected, with the occasional hint of mischief in his eye. What would he say now, faced with confirmation of what had been whispered about for years? And perhaps more importantly, what would the palace do to contain this revelation? Would secrecy prevail, as it often has in matters of royal scandal, or would the truth erupt into public consciousness in a way that could not be contained? By now, the stakes are clear. We're not just talking about a headline. We're talking about identity, legacy, love, betrayal, and the very human need for truth. This isn't tabloid fodder. This is a story that cuts to the core of what it means to be family, to know who you are, and to confront truths that may rewrite your understanding of your own life. And yet, even as Harry grapples with this new reality, there is a tantalizing question lingering in the air. What else is hidden? What secrets have been kept, not just about paternity, but about relationships, loyalty, and the emotional fabric of the royal family? For every answer revealed, new questions emerge. For every tear shed, a new mystery waits. And it is this tension, this delicate balance of revelation and suspense, that will carry us through the next hour, through the chapters of Harry's life, the choices he's made, and the consequences of a single DNA test that changed everything. The envelope sits open. The DNA results are clear. The truth is undeniable. Prince Harry's father, biologically speaking, is not the man the world assumed. It is James Hewitt. And with that knowledge comes a tidal wave of emotion, shock, grief, betrayal, confusion, and an unshakable need to understand how this could happen. How could a life so meticulously documented, scrutinized, and celebrated harbor a secret of this magnitude? How could the man who carried the title of king, the father of a prince, not be his father at all? And yet, the story does not end here. Because revelation, no matter how shocking, is only the beginning. The reactions, the confrontations, the fallout, these are what follow. The palace, the media, the public, and most importantly, Harry himself, must all navigate a landscape reshaped by one simple truth. And the way they navigate it will determine not only Harry's future, but the very perception of the royal family around the world. The first time Prince Harry truly questioned the world around him, he was no older than 5. He didn't know it then, but a seed had been planted, a seed of doubt, a tiny flicker of uncertainty about the people who were supposed to shape and protect him. In public, life was a fairy tale. The cameras captured smiling princes, waving hands, and carefully choreographed moments of joy. But behind the palace walls, things were far more complicated. The corridors of Kensington and later of Highgrove were filled with whispers, half-heard conversations, and subtle tensions that only a child with an unusually keen awareness could sense. Harry learned early that appearances were everything and that the truth often hid in the shadows. Diana, his mother, radiated warmth and charisma that captivated the public, but her private life was riddled with struggles. She had moments of tenderness with Harry and William, yet those moments often came with a backdrop of anxiety and secrecy. She worried about Charles, about her place in the monarchy, and, eventually, about her children. In those private moments, she spoke in hushed tones about the difficulties of palace life, the impossibility of finding genuine human connection, and the ever-present scrutiny that hovered over the family like a storm cloud. Harry, even as a child, began to notice the tension between smiles and words, between affection and restraint. Charles, meanwhile, was the distant figure every child longs for but rarely receives. Duty, protocol, and an unwavering commitment to public image often replaced the warmth of fatherly guidance. Harry's earliest memories of his father were punctuated by formality rather than intimacy. Lessons in etiquette, protocols for waving to crowds, and constant reminders of responsibility at an age when play and exploration should have been his main pursuits. It was not neglect in the malicious sense, but a void nonetheless. A child notices what is absent just as much as what is present, and Harry's intuition told him something was missing, something he couldn't quite name. And then there were the whispers. Rumors that floated through the palace like shadows, unnoticed by most adults, but never escaping the notice of a child attuned to emotional undertones. James Hewitt was a name that occasionally slipped into conversations, a subject of hushed speculation among staff, friends, and even occasional visitors. A cavalry officer, charming, poised, and rumored to have a close relationship with Princess Diana. As Harry grew, these whispers were like background noise, dismissed at the time, yet planting subtle seeds that would later grow into questions he could no longer ignore. The palace, with all its grandeur, served as both a playground and a prison. Harry had access to gardens, tutors, and toys that most children could only dream of, but he also lived under surveillance. Every movement, every smile, every tear was catalogued and scrutinized. Friends came and went, often chosen for their discretion rather than compatibility. Private moments were rare, and in the rare moments when the family was alone, the unspoken tension could be suffocating. Harry learned to read expressions, to notice the slightest change in tone, and to sense when a conversation was meant to shield rather than reveal. Even as a young boy, Harry felt the duality of his life. Publicly, he was a prince, carefree, smiling, and adored by millions. Privately, he was a child navigating emotional complexity, trying to make sense of loyalties and absences, of love and unspoken truths. He learned to compartmentalize, to smile when expected, and to internalize questions that had no immediate answers. Yet, in the quiet moments, away from the cameras and the crowds, he sometimes wondered about the whispers he had overheard. About Diana's expressions when she thought no one was watching. About fleeting glances between adults that hinted at stories left untold. School life brought a new layer of complexity. At times, Harry was teased, sometimes idolized, but always observed. Classmates knew him as a prince, a figure of fascination, but they didn't know the nuances of his home life. Teachers sometimes noticed his intensity, his quick temper, or his occasional melancholy, but they often attributed it to the pressures of public life. They didn't see the undercurrents, the questions swirling in a young boy's mind about who his father truly was, the subtle anxiety that he carried from palace whispers into the classroom, the sense that some truths were deliberately hidden from him. And yet, despite the tension, there were moments of joy. Diana had a way of turning ordinary days into magical experiences, whether through playful gestures, secret outings, or late-night storytelling. She encouraged Harry to express himself, to speak openly about emotions, and to seek connection beyond the walls of the palace. These moments of tenderness were the anchor in a life that often felt adrift. But even in these moments, there lingered an undercurrent of worry, an unspoken question that hovered in the air, too delicate to voice aloud. As Harry transitioned into adolescence, the whispers became harder to ignore. James Hewitt's name appeared in tabloids with increasing frequency, sometimes accompanied by salacious claims, sometimes by cautious speculation. Harry, now more aware of the world beyond the palace, began to understand the power of public perception. He recognized that the rumors, whether grounded in truth or not, were shaping not just his mother's narrative, but his own emerging identity. The boy who once simply wondered about the shadows around him now began to connect them to real-world consequences, seeing patterns where adults often dismissed them as coincidence. There were moments of confrontation, too. A quiet conversation with a friend, a subtle question posed to a tutor, an overheard remark from palace staff, each a puzzle piece in a growing mosaic of uncertainty. Harry's mind, already sharp and intuitive, began to assemble these pieces into patterns, noticing contradictions, discrepancies, and odd coincidences. Every smile from Charles, every sigh from Diana, every fleeting interaction with staff became a subject of analysis. And while he could not yet articulate it fully, he sensed that the truth about his paternity was a question that would demand an answer someday. The emotional weight of these experiences was compounded by the extraordinary circumstances of royal life. Public scrutiny, ceremonial obligations, and the constant gaze of the media created a pressure cooker environment. Every misstep, real or perceived, was amplified. Every rumor had the potential to explode into international headlines. And yet, in private, Harry was just a boy, vulnerable and searching for understanding, for validation, for clarity in a world that offered little transparency. Through all of this, Harry developed a resilience that would later define him. He learned to compartmentalize emotion, to navigate complex social dynamics, and to read between the lines in a way few children ever need to. But the cost was steep: a deep-seated anxiety, a sense of isolation, and the ever-present question of identity. Who was he really? And, perhaps more unsettlingly, who was the man he had been told was his father? The palace walls had held many secrets, and young Harry had begun to understand that secrets had a way of shaping reality, sometimes in ways that were irreversible. Each whispered rumor, each fleeting glance, each hushed conversation was a thread in a web that would eventually ensnare him in a revelation far beyond anything he could imagine as a child. The stage was set for the life-altering DNA test that would one day answer a question that had haunted him in silence for years. But before that fateful day, Harry's childhood remained a delicate balance of love and uncertainty, joy and tension, truth and secrecy. And as he navigated the intricate maze of royal life, he could never have known that the most profound questions about identity, loyalty, and family would soon demand answers. Answers that would shock not just him, but the entire world. What Harry didn't yet know was that the whispers of his early childhood were more than idle speculation. They were foreshadowing the storm to come, the revelation that would redefine everything he had known about his family, his past, and himself. And when that storm finally arrived, there would be no place to hide. From the moment his name entered the palace's quiet corridors, James Hewitt carried an aura of charm and intrigue that few could ignore. To the outside world, he was a cavalry officer, disciplined, dashing, and disciplined again, a figure who embodied both authority and charisma. But to those within the inner circle of the royal household, he represented something far more complicated, a man whose presence blurred boundaries and ignited whispers that would echo for decades. Hewitt's relationship with Princess Diana had been, by most accounts, intense and consuming. It was a bond that flourished in secrecy, nurtured by mutual admiration and, some speculated, by the loneliness of two individuals navigating the rigid confines of royal expectations. For Diana, whose life was meticulously choreographed by protocol and public expectation, Hewitt offered something rare: emotional intimacy, validation, and attention unmediated by the heavy hand of monarchy. He was a confidant, a companion, and in some ways, a mirror reflecting the emotions she had long suppressed. But it was not just Diana who was affected. The young princes, William and Harry, were inevitably drawn, knowingly or unknowingly, into the orbit of these adult relationships. Even as whispers of Hewitt's closeness to Diana circulated in the staff quarters, in hushed hallway conversations, and occasionally in the cryptic phrasing of palace insiders, Harry was absorbing them like a sponge. Children are adept at sensing tension and inconsistencies, even when adults think they remain oblivious. And the contrast between what was publicly displayed and what was privately experienced planted seeds of doubt in the young prince's mind, seeds that would later bloom into questions of identity. Hewitt himself was aware of the power he wielded, not over the royal family in a political sense, but over the private, intimate spaces they inhabited. His demeanor was a blend of confidence and restraint, charisma and calculation. To some, he appeared as a heroic figure from the cavalry, a man of action and loyalty. To others, especially those attuned to the subtle politics of the palace, he was a disruptor, a symbol of temptation and secrecy that challenged the carefully maintained image of the royal household. The rumors linking Hewitt to Harry's paternity were persistent, fueled by a combination of public fascination, palace leaks, and media speculation. Tabloids seized upon every interaction, every reported glance, every whispered remark as potential evidence of a scandalous truth. Some reports were sensationalized, exaggerated, or outright fabricated, yet the persistence of the speculation was enough to make even the most stoic members of the royal family uneasy. The human mind, after all, tends to dwell on patterns, coincidences, and insinuations, even when hard evidence is scarce. And for Harry, these insinuations were an invisible weight, shaping his understanding of family dynamics long before he fully grasped the implications. Hewitt's life outside the palace was equally compelling. Military service had instilled in him a sense of discipline and honor, yet his interactions with Diana revealed a more complex personality. A man capable of deep affection, strategic thinking, and calculated risk. He understood the stakes of his involvement with the princess, the potential for scandal, and the intense scrutiny of the public eye. And yet, he engaged with the relationship fully, knowingly navigating the treacherous waters of secrecy, loyalty, and emotional connection. The narrative surrounding Hewitt was also shaped by his own reflections, interviews, and writings over the years. In public statements, he maintained a measured tone, often expressing regret for the pain caused but also asserting his perspective on the events. To some, these statements were self-serving. To others, they provided a rare glimpse into the complex human emotions behind a tabloid-fueled scandal. For Harry, these narratives added another layer of confusion. Conflicting stories, partial truths, and selective revelations that complicated his understanding of who this man was and what role he may have played in his own life. The palace, for its part, responded with careful calculation. Advisors, aides, and legal teams worked to contain potential damage, to manage public perception, and to maintain an image of cohesion and dignity. This, in turn, reinforced the sense of secrecy and emotional distance that Harry experienced as a child. He learned early that the world of royalty demanded conformity, discretion, and the suppression of personal truth in favor of appearance. And yet, within that world, the tension between private reality and public narrative created fertile ground for suspicion, doubt, and ultimately, revelation. Hewitt's impact on the royal household was subtle but significant. It was felt not in grand gestures or public confrontations, but in the quiet unease that permeated private moments. Staff members whispered in corridors, friends exchanged guarded conversations, and Diana herself navigated a delicate balance between emotional fulfillment and public expectation. These dynamics, largely invisible to the public, shaped the emotional environment in which Harry grew up, teaching him to read between the lines, to sense inconsistencies, and to question appearances. For Harry, the idea that his father might not be Charles had long existed as an unspoken possibility, a shadow lurking in the background of his consciousness. It was a thought he could not articulate, an anxiety he could not confront, and a fear he could not fully process. Yet it was always there, faint but persistent, influencing his perceptions of family, identity, and trust. Hewitt, in this context, was not just a figure of speculation. He was a symbol of everything Harry sensed but could not yet name. The tension escalated over the years, fueled by media reports, palace speculation, and the natural curiosity of a growing child. Harry observed interactions between adults, noticed the subtleties of tone, and began to recognize patterns of secrecy and omission. These observations, combined with the ever-present whispers about Hewitt, gradually formed the outline of a question that would eventually demand a definitive answer. Could it be possible that the man who raised him was not his biological father? Even as an adult, the thought was both shocking and terrifying. To question the paternity of a prince is not merely a personal concern. It is a matter with political, social, and emotional implications of enormous magnitude. It challenges the foundation of lineage, inheritance, and public perception. Yet for Harry, the emotional stakes were far more immediate and personal. The need to understand who he was, where he came from, and how to reconcile love, loyalty, and betrayal. Hewitt, in retrospect, is a figure who embodies the complexity of human relationships, particularly those constrained by public expectation. He represents desire, secrecy, and intimacy, charm, risk, and the consequences of emotional connection. To the public, he was often reduced to rumor or caricature. To Harry, he would become inextricably linked with the most profound questions of identity, family, and truth. And as the years passed, the whispers, speculation, and subtle emotional undercurrents set the stage for the revelation that would finally bring clarity. The DNA test, the envelope, and the undeniable proof were all inevitable outcomes of a life shaped in part by secrecy, desire, and complex human relationships. What began as whispers in hallways, subtle glances, and guarded conversations would ultimately culminate in a truth that could no longer be denied. A truth that would shock not just Harry, but the world. The story of Prince Harry cannot be told without understanding the woman who shaped the first years of his life, who illuminated the path of love, empathy, and curiosity, even as her own world teetered on the edge of chaos. Princess Diana was, to the public, the people's princess, a figure of grace, beauty, and compassion. But behind the carefully curated smiles, the photo ops, and the global adoration, there existed a private life fraught with heartache, emotional complexity, and secrets that would ultimately ripple through the royal family in ways that no one could have anticipated. Even as a child, Harry was attuned to the tension around him. He could sense his mother's moods, the subtle shifts in her voice, the brief glances exchanged with those she trusted most. There were nights when she wept quietly in her room, and although Harry didn't fully understand the reasons, he knew they were connected to a sense of isolation, disappointment, and frustration. He sensed that Diana's struggles were not just about marital issues with Charles, but about something deeper. A profound loneliness in a world that demanded perfection and punished vulnerability. Diana's emotional world was complex. She struggled to reconcile the intense public scrutiny with her own desire for a fulfilling private life. The palace was both a stage and a cage, offering privileges unimaginable to ordinary people but demanding sacrifices that weighed heavily on her psyche. She navigated these pressures with remarkable grace, but the cracks were visible to those who looked closely. Harry, even as a young child, noticed them. He felt the weight of her moods, the silence that sometimes followed a smile, and the fleeting moments of openness that hinted at her inner turmoil. One of the most profound influences on Harry's early understanding of relationships was Diana's connection to James Hewitt. While the full details were never publicized, the whispers were impossible to ignore. Diana found in Hewitt a kind of companionship that she had been denied, a private refuge from the pressures of royal life. He listened, he advised, he cared. And yet, this connection existed alongside the expectations of duty and the complicated dynamic with Charles. For Harry, even as a child, this duality created confusion. He observed affection and secrecy, warmth and tension, and slowly began to understand that love and loyalty were not always straightforward. Diana's struggles were also compounded by the relentless media scrutiny. Every gesture, every glance, every perceived mistake was magnified. Paparazzi hovered near her residences, journalists speculated endlessly, and the tabloids thrived on rumor. The narrative of her marriage, her relationships, and her private life was never entirely hers to control. For Harry, the media's presence was a constant reminder that family life, private moments, and personal feelings were never truly private. He grew up understanding that reality could be manipulated, and that truth was often layered beneath a series of public performances. Mental health was another arena where Diana quietly fought battles that few in her circle could fully comprehend. She experienced periods of depression, anxiety, and emotional exhaustion, which were sometimes disguised with impeccable public composure. For Harry, witnessing these moments was both formative and confusing. He learned that strength could coexist with vulnerability, that public appearances could mask private struggles, and that the complexities of adult relationships often defied simple explanation. Perhaps the most significant secret that hovered over Harry's early life was the question of his paternity. Diana, aware of the rumors surrounding James Hewitt, often navigated these suspicions with caution. She protected her children from unnecessary exposure, but the subtle emotional cues were impossible for Harry to ignore completely. He sensed hesitation in conversations, the careful choice of words, and the occasional flicker of anxiety in his mother's expression. These were breadcrumbs of a larger truth that he would only fully confront decades later, through the undeniable clarity of a DNA test. Diana's approach to parenting was both nurturing and protective. She encouraged her sons to express themselves, to engage with the world, and to develop their own identities, even as she shielded them from the harshest realities of palace life. Her guidance was intuitive, empathetic, and often heroic in the context of the pressures she faced. Yet, despite her efforts, the emotional complexity of her relationships, particularly with Hewitt and Charles, created an environment where questions lingered, where certainty was elusive, and where the young Harry had to begin constructing his own understanding of identity and trust. The interplay of secrecy and revelation in Diana's life also taught Harry lessons about human behavior, loyalty, and deception. He observed the delicate balance she maintained between honesty and discretion, empathy and self-preservation. He learned to interpret the subtle language of relationships. The tone of a conversation, the weight of a glance, the nuance of a smile. These skills, honed in the crucible of royal life, would later become essential tools as he confronted the life-altering truths revealed by the DNA results. At the heart of Diana's struggles was an unspoken question that would resonate throughout Harry's life. How do you reconcile love, loyalty, and personal truth within a framework designed to suppress them? She grappled with this question constantly, and her answers were often imperfect, complicated, and deeply human. Harry, as her son, inherited both the emotional intelligence and the emotional burdens of this inheritance. He learned that family, even at the highest levels of society, is rarely simple. That love can coexist with betrayal, that trust can be fractured by secrecy, and that the truths we most desire are often the hardest to obtain. The whispers about James Hewitt were never far from Harry's consciousness. They were threads woven into the tapestry of his childhood, influencing his perceptions of adults, authority, and intimacy. Every interaction between Diana and Hewitt, every staff conversation that hinted at hidden truths, every media report that surfaced in the background contributed to a growing awareness that the life he had been led to believe in was more complex than it appeared. These observations laid the foundation for the emotional and psychological journey he would undergo decades later when the DNA results finally surfaced. Diana's struggles, while deeply personal, also highlight a broader reality. Even those who seem to live perfect, public lives grapple with profound emotional and relational challenges. For Harry, understanding his mother's battles was essential to understanding himself. He came to realize that vulnerability is not weakness, that love is not always straightforward, and that the people we hold dearest can carry secrets as heavy as our own. By the time Harry entered his teenage years, the cumulative effect of these early experiences had begun to shape his worldview. He had witnessed the interplay of public expectation, private desire, and emotional truth. He had absorbed the whispers, noticed the inconsistencies, and developed a heightened intuition about human behavior. These early lessons, forged in the crucible of his mother's struggles and the shadow of secrecy, would prove invaluable when he finally confronted the life-altering truth of his paternity. And yet, even with all these experiences, Harry could not have anticipated the emotional impact of the DNA results. The questions that had lingered in childhood, the whispers that had floated through palace corridors, and the subtle signs he had observed in Diana's behavior were about to converge into a revelation that would shock the world. A truth that would force him to reconcile the love for the mother who raised him, the loyalty to a father who may not be his own, and the complicated emotions surrounding a man whose presence had loomed over his earliest memories. The stage was set. The emotional groundwork had been laid. And as the whispers of the past began to crystallize into undeniable truth, Harry was on the cusp of discovering a secret that would redefine his understanding of family, love, and identity. The palace walls, grand and imposing as they were, could not contain whispers forever. By the time Prince Harry reached his early teens, the quiet speculation about James Hewitt had begun to escape the corridors of private life and seep into the public imagination. It started slowly as tabloid hints, veiled references in society columns, and the occasional gossip column that dared to speculate on Diana's personal life. But what had once been background noise in Harry's childhood was now escalating into a full-blown scandal, one that would ripple through the royal family and the world media alike. For Harry, the shift was both confusing and frightening. The whispers he had once sensed but not fully understood now became headlines splashed across newspapers and magazines worldwide. Questions that had been unspoken at home were suddenly being debated in public. Could James Hewitt be Prince Harry's biological father? What did Princess Diana's relationship with Hewitt mean for the royal lineage? Was this scandal threatening the monarchy itself? The boy who had once silently absorbed these uncertainties now found himself at the intersection of personal trauma and public spectacle. It was during these years that Harry began to understand the magnitude of his family's public exposure. Every outing, every photo opportunity, every official engagement was under scrutiny. Paparazzi followed Diana relentlessly, capturing candid moments, private smiles, and even fleeting glances that were interpreted as evidence of indiscretion. Every rumor about Hewitt became fuel for the media fire, and the young prince watched in silence as speculation became headlines, and headlines became global conversation. The dynamics at home were equally complicated. Charles, already distant, became increasingly frustrated with the relentless media attention. The tension between him and Diana escalated, and Harry often found himself caught in the middle, trying to navigate loyalties, emotions, and conflicting narratives. Staff members, tutors, and family friends whispered carefully, knowing that a misplaced word could ignite scandal, yet leaving enough unsaid to allow Harry's imagination to fill the gaps. These half-truths and omissions created a psychological landscape of uncertainty, curiosity, and tension that Harry could not escape. School life became another arena of complexity. Friends, aware of the rumors circulating in tabloids, sometimes teased or questioned him directly, often in subtle, cutting ways. Harry, already sensitive to inconsistencies and subtleties in adult behavior, developed a heightened awareness of public perception. He became adept at masking emotions, controlling facial expressions, and managing the interplay between private feelings and public expectation. The whispers of his childhood, combined with the relentless gaze of media scrutiny, forced him to mature emotionally far faster than most children his age. The public scandal surrounding James Hewitt was fueled not only by media speculation, but also by Diana's own complicated positioning. She wanted to protect her children, maintain her dignity, and preserve her public image, yet she could not fully control the narrative. Every action she took, every public statement or gesture, was dissected for hidden meaning, feeding into the cycle of rumor and speculation. For Harry, this duality, a mother trying to protect him while navigating her own challenges, created a tension that would shape his understanding of trust, secrecy, and personal identity. Meanwhile, James Hewitt, aware of the growing storm, remained largely disciplined in public statements. He did not fuel the media frenzy, but he did not deny it outright either. His restraint added a layer of intrigue. Speculation intensified precisely because there was no definitive denial. To the public, he became both an object of fascination and a symbol of the scandal itself, a man whose relationship with Diana had repercussions far beyond the immediate romantic entanglement. For Harry, the knowledge that Hewitt existed and had been close to his mother added emotional complexity to an already fraught adolescence. The rumors were not confined to Britain. International media outlets picked up on the whispers, translating them into sensational stories, sometimes exaggerating details, sometimes fabricating context. Magazines in Europe, tabloids in the United States, and news outlets in Asia all contributed to a narrative that was increasingly difficult to control. For Harry, this meant that his childhood was not just a personal journey, but a global spectacle. Every emotion, every thought, and every question about paternity became fodder for worldwide discussion, further heightening the emotional stakes. The situation reached a boiling point when certain tabloids began printing claims suggesting that James Hewitt might be Harry's biological father. The headlines were sensational, some bordering on defamatory, yet they were impossible to ignore. For a teenage prince already grappling with questions of identity, these claims were both shocking and terrifying. He had to reconcile loyalty to his father, Charles, with curiosity about the whispers that had followed him since childhood, and the emerging reality that the public believed something he could not yet confirm. At home, Diana attempted to shield Harry, but the very nature of secrecy and protection created contradictions. Some staff members offered explanations, others remained silent, and the overall effect was one of partial understanding, confusion, and emotional uncertainty. Harry learned that even those closest to him could not always offer clarity, that truth could be deferred, and that patience was sometimes the only option in a world dominated by public scrutiny. The psychological impact on Harry was profound. He developed an early awareness of the difference between appearance and reality, learning to navigate situations with emotional intelligence beyond his years. He became vigilant, observing interactions, noting inconsistencies, and questioning motives. He learned that secrecy could be protective but also isolating, and that public perception often diverged drastically from private reality. These lessons, though difficult, would later equip him with the resilience necessary to face the life-altering revelation of his DNA results. And yet, despite the public scandal, the whispers, and the emotional turbulence, Harry's life continued. He excelled in certain areas, found solace in friendships, and began exploring his interests and talents. But the backdrop of uncertainty, speculation, and rumor was always present, an invisible weight that shaped his emotional landscape and prepared him for the confrontation with truth that would arrive decades later. By the end of his adolescence, the combination of childhood whispers, adult secrecy, and public scandal had set the stage for the defining moment of Harry's personal journey. Every rumor, every media headline, every subtle indication of Hewitt's presence in his life contributed to a cumulative awareness that his identity might not align with the assumptions of the world. It was a slow-burning tension, a narrative that had been quietly unfolding behind palace walls, ready to culminate in a revelation that would shock the royal family and the world. And as the DNA test approached, the stage was set for the ultimate collision between private doubt and public certainty. The whispers of Harry's childhood had become headlines, the rumors of adolescence had become global fascination, and the question that had simmered for decades was finally about to receive an answer. It began as a quiet, almost clinical procedure, the kind of process designed to deliver clarity, not chaos. Prince Harry, now in his mid-30s, had been grappling with questions that had haunted him since childhood. The whispers, the rumors, the inconsistencies, the subtle hints in private conversations, they had all built into a crescendo of doubt that demanded resolution. And so, one morning in a private room, away from the cameras, the public eye, and even most of the palace staff, the DNA test was administered. For Harry, the act of submitting a sample was deceptively simple. A cheek swab, a vial of saliva, a form of evidence that could, in theory, settle questions that had lingered for decades. Yet, the emotional weight of this act was immense. It was not just a test of biology. It was a test of identity, a confrontation with truth, and a potential fracture in the family narrative that had defined his life. Every fiber of his being was tense. Every memory of childhood uncertainty, every whispered rumor about James Hewitt, every glimmer of doubt about Charles's paternal role surged to the forefront of his mind. The hours that followed were a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. Harry paced in the room, revisiting conversations from his past. He thought of Diana, imagining her reactions if she were alive to see this moment. He thought of Charles, wondering how their relationship might shift permanently, depending on the results. And he thought of Hewitt, the man whose name had been quietly intertwined with his family history for decades, now poised to emerge not as rumor, but as potential fact. Meanwhile, the palace staff operated with quiet precision. Security measures ensured privacy, while advisors and legal teams prepared contingencies. This was a moment of enormous sensitivity, not just for Harry, but for the monarchy as a whole. The DNA results, once confirmed, would have repercussions that went far beyond a single individual, touching legacy, lineage, public perception, and the carefully curated narrative of the royal family. When the results finally arrived, Harry could barely look at the envelope. His hands shook. His heart raced. For a moment, time seemed suspended, a brief pause in the universe where the weight of decades rested entirely on a single sheet of paper. He opened it slowly, almost ritualistically, as if the act itself could soften the blow. And then he saw it. The name, the figures, the incontrovertible truth staring back at him. James Hewitt. The room seemed to tilt, as though the walls themselves were collapsing. Shock coursed through him. Confusion followed. A strange mix of grief, anger, and relief washed over him in waves. For decades, he had lived believing that Charles was his father, shaping his understanding of identity, loyalty, and love around this assumption. And now, that foundation had been irrevocably shaken. His biological father was not the king, it was James Hewitt. Immediately, a flood of questions surged. How could this have been hidden for so long? Why did Diana choose to protect him from this truth during her life? What did this mean for his relationship with Charles, with William, with the royal family? And what would the world think when they discovered the revelation that Harry now held in his hands? The emotional impact was profound. Harry sank into a chair, trying to process the layers of betrayal, confusion, and unresolved grief that had accumulated over decades. Memories of childhood, of whispers, of subtle glances between adults, of hints that he had sensed but never fully understood, all converged in a painful tapestry. He realized that every relationship, every bond, every interaction had been influenced by a hidden truth he could now confront head-on. Yet, even in the midst of shock, there was clarity. The DNA results answered questions that had plagued him since childhood, questions that had shaped his understanding of self and family. He could finally see, in black and white, the biological reality of his existence. But the emotional reality was far more complicated. Biology, he realized, did not erase love, loyalty, or years of shared experience. Charles had raised him. He had guided him, protected him, and shaped his life. The revelation did not negate the fatherly role Charles had played, but it did redefine it in ways that were painful, unsettling, and transformative. The first calls Harry made were not to the public or the media, but to the few individuals he trusted implicitly. He needed to speak to someone who could help him process the emotional turbulence. Each conversation was a delicate balance, confirming facts, sharing feelings, and preparing for the inevitable moment when the world would learn the truth. For those who knew him best, the revelation was both shocking and, in a strange way, validating. An explanation for the subconscious doubts and questions that had lingered for so long. The palace, once aware of the results, moved quickly to contain potential fallout. Advisors discussed messaging, public perception, and the delicate task of managing both Harry's personal response and the broader implications for the monarchy. Media teams prepared strategies to address inevitable leaks. Legal counsel weighed the ramifications of disclosure, considering everything from succession protocols to public statements. And amidst all of this, Harry was left to navigate the emotional landscape alone, reconciling decades of trust, love, and expectation with the undeniable reality of his biological heritage. In the hours that followed, Harry's mind returned repeatedly to his mother. Diana had long been rumored to have had a complex relationship with Hewitt. Now, with confirmation in hand, Harry felt a complicated blend of sorrow, admiration, and anger. Sorrow for the secrets she carried, admiration for her strength in protecting him, and anger at the years of uncertainty that had accompanied whispers he could never fully ignore. The revelation cast her life and choices in an entirely new light, as both protective and, perhaps inadvertently, deceptive. The emotional impact extended to his own identity. Harry realized that his sense of self had been shaped by assumptions that were now irrevocably challenged. He questioned what it meant to be a prince, a son, and a member of the royal family. He questioned the narratives he had inherited, the loyalty he had cultivated, and the love he had received. And he questioned the world's perception of him. How would the public respond to a truth that shattered conventional understanding, that blurred the line between loyalty and biology, love and deception? Even as the shock reverberated, Harry understood that revelation was only the beginning. The questions would not end with a test result. Conversations with Charles would be unavoidable. Public statements, careful and measured, would be necessary. The media, relentless and insatiable, would descend upon the story, dissecting every nuance, every emotion, every detail. And for Harry, the challenge would be not just managing public perception, but processing the personal truth that had been hidden for so long. And yet, amid the emotional chaos, there was a moment of clarity, understanding, finally, who he was, where he came from, and the reality that had eluded him for decades. The DNA test had delivered a truth so profound it reshaped his identity, challenged his loyalties, and demanded reckoning. The moment Prince Harry knew he had to confront his father, King Charles, was one of the most difficult in his life. The DNA results, clear and undeniable, had settled the question of biology, but the emotional and relational consequences were only beginning. He was no longer just a son seeking identity. He was a man facing a monumental reckoning, balancing love, loyalty, betrayal, and the need for truth in a family whose every interaction was observed by the public eye. The palace corridors felt heavier than ever that day. Harry walked through them with a mix of determination and hesitation, every step echoing in the quiet halls where protocol and history intersected with secrecy. The grandeur of the walls, the portraits of ancestors, the polished floors, all reminders of centuries of tradition, suddenly felt oppressive. This was a confrontation that had nothing to do with duty, ceremony, or public image. It was intensely personal, raw, and unprecedented. Charles, for his part, had been informed by a discreet aide that Harry wished to speak privately. He approached the meeting with a composed exterior, his decades of public scrutiny and experience in handling crises sharpening his ability to mask inner emotions. Yet, even the most seasoned monarch is human. In his mind, there must have been a recognition that this conversation could fracture long-held assumptions, challenge family bonds, and, quite possibly, alter the narrative of his reign. The meeting began with cautious words. Courtesies were observed, pleasantries exchanged, and then the weight of the unsaid filled the room. Harry did not waste time. The envelope containing the DNA results sat between them like a silent witness. With measured hands but a racing heart, he placed it on the table. Charles's eyes flicked to it, a subtle tightening of his jaw, a momentary pause that betrayed emotions beneath the surface. "Harry, what is this about?" Charles asked, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of tension. Harry exhaled, a mixture of anger, frustration, and grief building inside him. "I need to know the truth, Dad. For decades, I've felt something that didn't add up. And now I have the proof." He pushed the envelope toward Charles, the paper practically vibrating with the weight of revelation. Charles took it slowly, reading the figures and names that would forever alter their relationship. For a man who had always represented duty, stoicism, and tradition, this moment was a collision of emotion and protocol. The clarity of the test results, naming James Hewitt as Harry's biological father, could not be ignored. The evidence was undeniable. The moment of truth was absolute. For Harry, the confrontation was not just about biology. It was about trust, identity, and the emotional fallout of secrets kept too long. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't anyone tell me the truth?" he asked, voice breaking. There was no accusation of malice, just raw emotion. The cry of a son who had lived decades with lingering uncertainty and whispered doubts. Charles's response was carefully measured. He maintained dignity, spoke in terms of family loyalty, and acknowledged his role in raising Harry. "I may not be your biological father, Harry," he said, "but I have loved you, raised you, and done my best to guide you. Biology doesn't define the bond between father and son." His words were true in intention, yet the reality of the revelation lingered between them like a shadow. The conversation was tense, emotional, and filled with unspoken undercurrents. Harry struggled with a cascade of feelings: betrayal, confusion, grief, but also gratitude for the upbringing he had received. He recognized that Charles's love had been genuine, even if the biological connection was absent. Still, the question of secrecy, of how and why this had been hidden, gnawed at him. Emotions fluctuated between anger and understanding, between confrontation and reflection. Harry demanded answers, sought clarity, and probed for understanding, while Charles attempted to navigate a delicate balance between transparency, dignity, and paternal reassurance. The discussion touched upon Diana, James Hewitt, the pressures of public life, and the intricacies of maintaining family unity under extraordinary scrutiny. Each revelation, each acknowledgement, heightened the tension, making the conversation feel like a delicate dance between honesty and diplomacy. At one point, the conversation shifted to the practical implications. What did this mean for titles, inheritance, and public perception? How would the monarchy address a revelation of this magnitude? Legal advisors and aides hovered discreetly outside, aware that this conversation would have far-reaching consequences. Yet, for Harry and Charles, the stakes were deeply personal. It was about reconciling love, trust, and identity. About understanding a relationship shaped by decades of assumptions suddenly challenged by irrefutable truth. The most difficult moment came when Harry confronted Charles with the weight of years lived under uncertainty. All those times I wondered if I truly belonged, all those moments of doubt. How could this have been hidden from me? His voice trembled, a mixture of pain and the release of suppressed emotion. Charles responded with a quiet acknowledgement, expressing regret for any unintentional hurt, emphasizing the love he had felt in raising Harry, and highlighting the importance of the bond they shared, regardless of biology. Even after the conversation ended, the emotional resonance lingered. Harry understood the complexity of human relationships, the role of circumstance and secrecy, and the limitations of understanding in a world governed by protocol, duty, and media scrutiny. He realized that while biology could explain some truths, it could not erase decades of experience, love, and shared history. Yet, the revelation demanded reconciliation, reflection, and emotional processing, a journey far from over. And as he left the room, Harry understood that confronting Charles was only the beginning. The world, already ravenous for royal news, would soon learn of a truth that would shock millions. Relationships would be tested, loyalties questioned, and public perception challenged. Harry was not only reconciling with his father, he was preparing to face a global audience with a revelation that would change the monarchy forever. The moment the DNA results reached the press, the world erupted. For decades, whispers had existed in tabloid columns, hushed rumors, and palace corridors. But now, with irrefutable evidence in hand, the speculation exploded into a global media storm that would not subside. Headlines blared from London to New York, from Paris to Tokyo. Prince Harry not Charles's son? James Hewitt confirmed as biological father? Royal lineage shattered. Every major outlet rushed to cover the revelation, their reporting a mix of fact, speculation, and sensationalism. For Harry, the initial shock was compounded by the scale of public exposure. The story that had once been private, confined to the palace and select advisors, was now a spectacle consumed by millions. Social media platforms erupted in debates, memes, and commentary. The world that had always scrutinized the royal family now faced a revelation that questioned everything they believed about lineage, loyalty, and the narrative of one of the most famous families in history. The palace's communications team moved quickly, attempting to control the narrative, release statements, and manage the fallout. Carefully worded phrases emphasized the personal bond between Harry and Charles, acknowledging the fatherly relationship that had shaped his upbringing while delicately navigating the unavoidable truths of biology. Yet, for the public, the nuances were often lost in the sensational headlines, the viral clips, and the 24-hour news cycles. Every sentence was dissected, every word scrutinized, and every reaction magnified. Media outlets offered endless speculation. Analysts debated the implications for the monarchy, the line of succession, and public trust. Tabloids published exclusive interviews with former palace aides, friends of Diana, and even James Hewitt himself, attempting to fill in narrative gaps with anecdotes, innuendo, and conjecture. Some reports were wildly exaggerated. Others remained restrained, focusing on factual confirmation. But the cumulative effect was a tsunami of information that left the public fascinated, horrified, and hungry for more. Harry's life, once carefully shielded from direct exposure, became front-page news. Every public appearance, every social engagement, every word he spoke was scrutinized for authenticity and emotional resonance. He had to navigate not just personal emotions, but the expectations of an audience that felt entitled to understand, judge, and interpret his every move. The boundary between private grief and public spectacle dissolved, leaving him exposed in ways that few could comprehend. Family members faced their own battles with media intrusion. Charles, William, and other royal figures were forced to address questions they had never anticipated. Meetings with advisors and legal teams became daily necessities, focusing on messaging strategy, potential crises, and mitigating reputational damage. William, as Harry's brother and heir to the throne, faced the additional challenge of reconciling loyalty to family with the expectations of public leadership. Each interaction, each appearance, became a delicate negotiation between truth, emotion, and public perception. Public opinion was divided. Some viewed the revelation with empathy, understanding the complexity of family dynamics, secrecy, and emotional nuance. Others were unforgiving, framing the news as scandalous, embarrassing, or even a betrayal of royal tradition. The polarization was stark, reflecting both fascination with the human story and the cultural weight of monarchy as an institution. Social media amplified every perspective, creating a cacophony of voices that demanded explanation, judgment, and narrative resolution. For Harry, the emotional toll was immense. Every notification, every news alert, every media clip was a reminder of the world's attention and the irreversible nature of public disclosure. Even as he attempted to process personal feelings of shock,